I'm glad somebody asked that question because I think a lot of times couples get married without even thinking about whether there are moral considerations with birth control. And sometime later in their marriage, they might come across something that tells them, oh, some form they've been using or used to use has some moral considerations. So there's a few key points that I want to address. We need to recognize that our culture breeds a sort of procreative liberty. In fact, it's one of the highest values that some people hold, and that includes what I would call a birth control mentality with the emphasis on control, right? We want to be in control of everything. And often this is quite contrary to the biblical picture of children as a gift from God, because of course, gifts are something that we receive, not something that we are completely in control of. And so when we consider the use of birth control, I think one of the things that we want to be clear on is that children are a gift. We can never have complete control, or we should never have complete control over the process of procreation. And sometimes the use of birth control, at least in our culture, portrays children as a burden to marriage. Children get in the way of marriage. And even sometimes evangelicals can have a tendency to think in these terms. So we need to be careful about that. Then the second consideration is that there's two basic kinds of birth control that I would address. One is those forms of birth control that prevent conception from taking place. And the other are forms of birth control that act after conception, which would prevent the newly created human life, the new embryo, from implanting in the mother's womb. So methods that prevent fertilization would include barrier methods such as condoms or diaphragm, or we might include, it's a little bit different, but we might include in this natural family planning, in which the way this works is that intercourse takes place when the woman is not in her fertile period. So there's no conception that takes place there either. Those methods that act after fertilization would include things like implants, hormonal implants, IUDs, or RU486. And these operate as a form of abortion in effect, an abortifacient effect, because they act after fertilization has taken place, preventing the embryo from implanting in the womb. Now, one other form that I would mention here would be oral contraceptives. This is very commonly used, and there is some controversy among evangelicals about this because of how they operate. So one of the secondary effects of oral contraceptives, or I'll say birth control pills, is that they will thin the uterine lining, making implantation difficult. So some evangelicals have come out very vocally in opposition to birth control pills because of this effect, while others will come back and say, we need to think more carefully about this in some ways, because their rationale is that if breakthrough ovulation occurs, the pill has failed. And if the pill has failed, then it is likely not acting to thin the uterine lining, so it's not creating a more hostile place for implantation. In fact, they would argue, if conception occurs after breakthrough ovulation, then the woman's body is starting to produce hormones that will make the uterus friendly for implantation. So I'm not a medical doctor. I've read a lot of the literature on this, but I would counsel couples to refer to a healthcare provider who can give better information or fuller information, and for couples to discuss that with their healthcare provider. Although they should recognize that sometimes their healthcare provider won't have any objection to types of birth control that do prevent implantation. So they need to recognize that and simply ask questions about how the particular form works. So a third consideration has to do with if you are looking at those forms of birth control that are acceptable because they don't prevent implantation, then we might want to consider some basic things. I mean, this is just marriage 101, that we ought to be in agreement on the form that we use. And neither the husband nor the wife ought to put pressure on the other to use a particular form. And a given couple may find one form of birth control more burdensome than another, and that may vary from couple to couple. So we need to think about these things together. The last point that is often raised is the issue of permanent measures. So something like a tubal ligation for the wife or a vasectomy for the husband. And one of my concerns here is that this is qualitatively different from other forms of birth control. So the fact that it's permanent, one of the things that I would teach about marriage is that since procreation is one of the purposes of marriage, we ought to always be open to procreation. And it seems to me difficult to say in what meaningful way we are open to the gift of procreation if we've taken a permanent measure to avoid procreation. Now, there still may be reasons for doing that, and so I don't want to say that just to do this is wrong, but some of those reasons might be because of the couple's age, and they've had a number of children, and now they're up in age, or maybe there's a high risk of a genetic problem. Or there might be some other reasons, but I would exercise great caution if it's just a matter of having had 1 or 2 or 3 children and deciding we don't want any more, so this is going to be our effective method. I would be very cautious about that. One of the questions that students often ask me is, in what sense can you be open to the gift of children if you're using contraception? And my answer to that is because overall, you can be open to the gift of children, but for a time you may simply be using contraception. And I would illustrate this, in fact, in my own life when we had our 3rd child, and it was a difficult time for my wife because it was a difficult labor and delivery, and our daughter was having some difficulty thriving. And so we weren't planning on getting pregnant anytime soon. And so we were using contraception for the time being. And within about 2 months, she found out that she was pregnant again. Now, if you're open to the gift of procreation, the way I would illustrate that is that you receive that news with joy. And frankly, it came a little bit as a shock, and we weren't sure how we were going to handle that. But it did come as a gift from God, and so we received that with joy, and we're quite pleased. The bottom line is then, when you consider contraception or you consider birth control methods, there's a distinction between those that prevent fertilization and those that act after fertilization. And I would reject those that act after fertilization. And then finally, just to remember that whether planned or not, every child is a gift from God of immeasurable value.
Thanks for watching Honest Answers. You can submit your questions by email, Twitter, or in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to find out the answer to next Wednesday's question.